All right, y'all, for the next 7 weeks, we are going to explore our stories together, our story in the midst of God's bigger story. We're going to explore the importance of storytelling, sharing our stories with one another. And throughout this series, our ultimate question is going to be, what would it look like for you to live a better, more meaningful story? So today we're going to start in the book of Genesis. Genesis is the first book of the Old Testament, or the Hebrew Bible, and I think Genesis asks us this really interesting and simple question, and that is, do you believe that what God created is good? This is our starting place because I'm convinced that how we answer and how we engage this question determines what kind of story we live. Because the truth is, I can't tell y'all how many people I still encounter who have given up on God, or they've given up on the church project because somewhere along the way they were told that the story is bad, that the whole thing is somehow fundamentally flawed. Not only is the world fundamentally flawed, but they are flawed too. So that when God sees them, God doesn't see something beautiful, but instead sees a great disappointment. That when God sees them, God doesn't see someone of great value and great worth, but instead God sees someone who's a screw up and can't measure up. So, we begin in the beginning because beginning in the beginning is the best place to start. Are you with me? All right, so in the book of Genesis, there are two different creation stories. The first creation story is told in Genesis chapter 1, and it goes through the early part of chapter 2 through verse 4a, the first part of verse 4. The second story of creation, a different account of creation, is told in Genesis chapter 2, verse 4b, the second part of verse 4, and it goes all the way through chapter 3, all the way through chapter 2, all the way through chapter 3, and chapter 3, of course, has 24 verses in it. So that's the second story. This morning, we're going to hang out primarily in the first story, in Genesis 1. And in Genesis 1, there are three primary movements in this story. The first one is the story is good. All of creation is good. The second is the story isn't static. It's constantly moving. It's headed somewhere. And third, the creation, the whole story, all of it is holy, sacred, and blessed. So a couple things you might want to know about this Genesis 1 poem. And y'all know it's a poem, right? It's a poem of creation, and it reads like a very traditional ancient Hebrew poem in its structure, in its rhythm, and everything about it. And here's what's fascinating about this creation poem. It splits the creation of the world up into 6 days, and after each day, God kind of stops and says, this is good. This is good. After day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5, after day 6, not only does God step back and say this is good, God steps back and he's overlooking the animal kingdom and the plant world and humanity that has just been created, and God says, this is very good. CEB translates it, the Common English Bible, as this is supremely good. Now, in this opening story of creation, God creates the world in such a way that the world produces more, that the created things have this ability to keep on creating. So think about a tree with me for just a moment. A tree doesn't just sprout and grow and thrive to become its own beautiful tree, right? Trees produce seeds, and these seeds fall to the ground, and trees grow, and then those trees produce more trees, and those trees produce more trees, and those trees produce more trees, and no one tree looks or feels the exact same. Think about what happens on the third day. What happens in our tradition on the third day? Oh, come on, y'all. Resurrection, new life, something new is booming and blooming forth. Here's how the poem puts it in chapter 1, verse 11. Then God said, "Let the land sprout vegetation, seed-bearing plants and trees on the land that bear fruit with seed in it, according to their various kinds." And it was so. Now, in this verse, you get this word that I want you all to learn with me. It's this word, dasha. Dasha isn't just a Hebrew word, it's a Hebrew verb. Say that word with me, dasha. Dasha. See, when you're dashaing, you're doing something. It's an action word. It means to sprout or to bring forth. The story of creation is headed somewhere. It isn't static. It is constantly recreating, and it's not just God, but these created things now are being invited into the creating process. Are you still with me? Hang with me because we are going somewhere. All right. In this opening creation poem, you get this word 3 different times. It's the word barakah. Say that word with me, barakah. And it means to bless, or sometimes you'll see its root word, baruch, and it means to bless. And you get it in chapter 1, verse 22, chapter 1, verse 28, and at the very end, chapter 2, verse 3 in this opening poem. Here's how 128 reads. This is towards the end, after all things have been created. God blessed, barakah, God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves upon the earth." God blessed it, everything, all of creation is holy, sacred, and blessed, barakah. In this opening story, there isn't somewhere else. All the good stuff, all the action is right here because everything is spiritual. Now, I know we struggle with this a bit in our culture because we're good at compartmentalizing our lives and our spirituality. And we say things like, well, when I go to church, well, that's spiritual. When I'm in this place, it's spiritual. But if I'm just going to work, well, that's not spiritual. That's just something I have to do to sustain. Well, and if I'm praying, well, then that's spiritual. But if I'm just at home having dinner with the family, well, that's not spiritual. That's just something we have to do together. We have to sustain. If I'm talking with my friends about God, well, that's spiritual. But if we're just hanging out and having spaghetti for dinner, well, that's not really spiritual. That's just something else. You know, when I was in seminary, there were quite a few students that we called second career students, students who had a career in something else, but they were leaving that career to study in seminary to pick up a new career in ministry. And it was always fascinating talking to them because some of them would say things like, and many of them are my friends, they would say things like, well, before I was just an attorney, or before I was just a small business owner, or I was just a stay-at-home mom, or just a stay-at-home dad, or I was just a nurse. But I'm leaving that because I want to get into the real action and make a difference in people's lives. And now I don't want to doubt anyone's calling, right? Because God calls us to different things. We have different passions, different leanings. God's working in us each differently. But at some point, maybe we need to hear the alternative message that where you are right now, your work, your craft, your hobby, your life, the thing that you love to do, the thing that you're doing, it is holy, sacred, and blessed barakah, because all of creation is holy, sacred, and blessed, the whole story. You know, when Tammy, my wife, and I, when we started dating back in college, she was a Starbucks barista. A couple of years after that, she managed that Starbucks. And when we were dating and early in our marriage, I would love to go study at Starbucks, you know what I mean? And the truth is, I loved watching Tammy in action. I think it's one of the reasons I fell so deeply in love with her. To see her interact with every single customer that came through the door. It was quite amazing to me. She knew all of their names. She knew their stories. They knew her story. Sometimes she would be like offering counsel as she's making a latte. Like, I don't know, Jack. I mean, how did that make you feel when she said that? You know what I mean? Oftentimes, I would walk in, and this happened countless times. She would say, oh, you got to meet my husband. Let me introduce you to my husband. Ryan, meet Mark and Judy. Mark and Judy, their son, just graduated from high school. Okay? No, Ryan, that's a big deal, because if you knew what their son has been through, no one thought this day was coming. And now he's graduating. So, Ryan, what you need to do is mark your calendar, because next Saturday we're going to be at Mark and Judy's house celebrating with them. All right, honey, that'll be fun. Oftentimes, I would walk through the door of that Starbucks to have lunch with Tammy on her break, or to have coffee together, and she would give me one of these. She was sitting at a table with one of the customers, and she'd give one of these. You know, the universal sign for don't come in yet, you're going to screw the whole thing up, this is important. And then what would happen sometimes is this person would then stand up from the table, and they would be in tears as they're leaving. And the first couple of times this happened, it was like, dang, honey, that didn't go so well, did it? What'd you do? And then it would be, no. That's Sarah. She just lost her husband to cancer. And she wanted to talk, and she wanted to pray together. Now, sometimes she would come home at night, and she would say something like, you know, I just got my psychology degree, and it's like I'm not using my degree, and I feel like I should be using my degree to make a difference in people's lives. And I'm like, hold up here. Honey, do you see what you're saying? I mean, day in and day out, these people come in to get a coffee, but they come in for your counsel and for your wisdom, and you get to celebrate with these people, and you get to cry with these people and pray with these people in the workplace. How cool is that? And you want to leave that to get into the real action in some office somewhere? You see, my brothers and sisters, the whole thing is holy, sacred, and blessed barakah when you leave in the morning, holy, sacred, and blessed. Because the principles and ethics that you live by, the God that you have encountered, well, that matters when you interact with your coworkers or your clients or your customers or whoever it is that you're serving. And if you are a stay-at-home mom or stay-at-home dad and you're spending time with those babies, well, those principles and ethics and the God that you've encountered, well, then it all matters, doesn't it? Because you get to instill this into children. And when you come home at night, and it's been a long day at work, and you are making dinner together as a family and eating, that too is spiritual, because it's all holy, sacred, and blessed. And when you eat spaghetti with your friends, that too is holy, sacred, and blessed. See, where we begin matters. And the story starts here. However, some people choose to begin the story in Genesis chapter 3, and I think it's a bit late to be beginning the story there. In Genesis chapter 3, sin enters the story. Many of you remember this story. Adam and Eve, they were created, and they're in this garden, and God says there's this beautiful tree in the middle, but don't eat of the fruit of that tree. And life was all good until that dang talking snake comes along and persuades them to eat of the tree, you know? And they eat the fruit, and then they're kicked out. They're expelled from the garden. And there are different ways to think about sin. But I think the most helpful way to think about it is the disruption of shalom. And remember, shalom, it's that Hebrew concept of peace and wholeness and well-being and completeness. And see, in Genesis 1, we're given this image of shalom. And it's like the perfect image. Creator and created are at peace. All created things are at peace with one another. Things are put into their proper order and their proper place. And see, when we live apart from shalom, we feel it, don't we? We feel disconnected. we feel out of order, out of sync with all creation, out of sync with what God is doing all around us. If you begin your story in Genesis 3, your primary concern will be the removal of sin. You'll be busy telling people who you aren't, and it's not interesting. I'm not good enough. I'm not worthy enough for God. I'm just a sinner, not righteous enough. And historically, what happens here theologically is, well, then you're bad. You're sinful. In fact, God has been against you from the very beginning, and if you don't change, God is going to punish you forever. And by the way, this life isn't all that important, because what's important? The main goal is that you have the right head beliefs about God so that when you die, you can finally escape this awful place and get to some better place. You see, in this theology, the action, all the good stuff, it isn't right here, right now. It's somewhere else. But if you begin your story in Genesis 1, the problem isn't the removal of sin, but the restoration of shalom. How do we make it better right here, right now? How do we live better stories here and now? How do we join with God in bringing heaven down to earth? And by the way, what changes people? Is it telling them how bad they are, how sinful they are? Not in my experience. Fear might cause a temporary change, but what really changes people? What transforms the human heart? That has always been God's grace and love. Think about your own experience. Wasn't it grace that changed you, transformed you? You know, I was meeting with a guy recently, and he told me that he had made a mess of things. And I said to him, dude, it can't be that bad. It's nothing we can't fix. And then he went on to tell me the story. And I said, yeah, you've made a mess of things. You've caused a great deal of harm and damage. He said, I know. And that's why when it comes to people like me, God's forgiveness isn't for me. He said, it's like the thing that I've done, it got me kicked out, and I know God doesn't want me back. And see, when I hear stories like this, and you all hear them too because they're so common, when we hear stories like this, I think we have to remember to Genesis 1-ify them. You know what I mean? Because I think God was with us on that patio that afternoon, and God was sitting in the midst of this conversation, and God says, seriously? Seriously? You know that when I created you, I stood back and I said, this is good. And you know that when you took your first breath, I stood back and I said, this is really good. You think I'd give up on that? You think I'd give up on that? You see, my brothers and sisters, do you believe that what God created is good? And yes, it's true. We can make a mess of things. We as individuals, we as communities, as people, as nations, we can make a great mess of things. We can disrupt shalom in 1,000 different ways. We can live apart from peace and wholeness and well-being and completeness. We have the power to do that, don't we? We have free will to do that, don't we? But do you believe that what God created is good? Does God still believe that what God created is good? And does God still believe that all creation, all of it, is holy, sacred, and blessed, barakah? And it was so. Amen.